This is my great pleasure, and Your Excellency, yesterday, what you said about this hotel, it really resonated with a lot of us. So thank you for giving us that piece of history, and we feel the weight of history, let's put it that way. Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to moderate this panel. The topic is rebalanced globalization and how the G20 leadership has been able to kind of set a new kind of motto towards a new world order in terms of how globalization will proceed. And it was interesting that from the morning we heard about digital public infrastructure, we heard about climate finance, we heard about how the challenges of logistics and supply chains. So in a sense, we are in a stage where the tenets of globalization that started with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1990 are being challenged. And they're being challenged because of two things. One is that after the global financial crisis, the basic tenets of free markets, free trade, free movement of goods and people, I think that orthodoxy of globalization has kind of taken a hit. And then came the COVID crisis, and we saw from the viewpoint of developing countries how a lot of the developing countries were at the back of the queue when it came to getting vaccines, when it came to getting out of the crisis. So the last week, or earlier this week, my organization, ORF America, I'm a senior fellow at ORF America, we released a book called Rebalancing Globalization, Perspectives from the Global South, and there are it's freely downloadable from the website, so I'm putting a plug for the book as well. And I think the panel that we have will kind of try to explore some of these issues. So in the book, what we have tried to do is to look at the new phase of globalization from the perspectives of the Global South. The earlier phase, I would submit to you, was driven by the Global North, setting the rules, enforcing those rules, and also to see to it that when it came to the benefits, it was not distributed equally. That's debatable, but I think the recent literature, if anyone is following the topic of globalization, will kind of agree on that. So how does a rebalanced globalization look like when you look at it from the perspectives of the Global South? And within the discussions of this Cape Town conversation, we kind of have come to getting to an agreement that there are three objectives that the new rebalanced globalization has to address. Issue of jobs and macroeconomic stability, the issue of supply chains and trade, which is coming under pressure, and the issue of climate action. These three big objectives, and there may be others, but these are the three most pressing objectives that the rebalanced globalization paradigm needs to address. And there are three key instruments that we are trying to also come to an agreement with. One is reform of global institutions. We have heard panel after panel, speaker after speaker, call for reform of the UN, reform of the multilateral development banks. We'll have a panel later on in the day about this. The second, I think the whole issue of sustainable finance, financing for development. There's a conference which is going to be held in June in Seville, the 4th Financing for Development Conference. But what would be new? How can the Global South set the agenda rather than be the takers of an agenda? And the third, I think we heard in the morning, was digitalization. Digital public infrastructure, how does the digital world affect the new global scenario and the one that benefits the Global South? So we'll try to tie all this together. We have a stellar panel representing 4 of the G20 countries, including myself from India. But let me introduce Pamela Gopal, who is the head of the Policy Bridge think tank, AU Development Authority. So Pamela, you represent both South Africa and AU, so you have a big job on your hands. Then I have to my right, Riatu Kivitya, who's the director, or former director, you said, of the Institute of Economic and Social Research, University of Indonesia. And then we have Mr. Almin Nascimento, who is the Director of International Relations Research Institute of the Alexandre Guzmão Foundation, who were the hosts very kindly of the Think Tank 20 in Rio last week, or 2 weeks ago. And we have Mr. Takayuki Sato, who is the Regional Head of Europe, Middle East, and Africa for the Japan Bank of International Cooperation. So to tie all this together, let's start with Pamela. Pamela, you have a chapter in the book on jobs, macroeconomic stability, and growth. So how do you see, from your vantage point in South Africa as well as the African continent, how does a rebalanced globalization look like, and how do you rebalance it in a way that it benefits Africa?
Thank you, Anit, and hello everyone. Just want to use this opportunity again to thank ORF and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. I very proudly sit here today as President Thabo Mbeki was the founding father and thought leader of the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, now, or then, and that was over about 2 decades ago. So, sir, I hope that we have done you right, and thank you very much for being here throughout the session. In the book, we looked at various aspects, and the fundamental objectives of rebalancing globalization came from economic equity, and that is basically seeing the benefits of globalization through a good distribution of across countries that focuses to reduce the wealth gap on developing and developed countries. We also look at sustainable development in terms of promoting environmental sustainability by integrating green technology and practices into global trade and industrial processes. The other one is the social inclusion by improving access to education, healthcare, digital and digitalization in order to empower marginalized communities. And the importance of social protection is an important component of balanced globalization strategies for addressing this high levels of informality in the labor market. We also looked at instruments like trade policies, fair trade policies, and the trade agreements that prioritize fair trade labor practices as well as environmental standards, as well as the importance of international cooperation and capacity building. These also, by providing safety nets in terms of promoting inclusive growth, is two-pronged. It has economic stability benefits, especially in terms of times of crisis where the vulnerable populations are affected the most, and as well as reducing poverty and equality in order to ensure that the basic needs are met in terms of providing opportunities for upward mobility. I'd like to also just allude to 3 good examples, I think, on social protection programs that are we see prevalent in, for example, Brazil, India, and South Africa. In terms of Brazil, we have conditional cash transfers programs that leverages on technology and enhancing the efficiency of reducing poverty by improving health and education. And this has been seen as a very good model across most countries. As well as in India, we see India's Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and this program provides guarantee employment to rural households, helping reduce poverty and stimulate local economies. And here in South Africa, we have a multifaceted approach to social security measures in terms of social grants, which are comprehensive, that includes not only the aged but also child support grants, etc. And I think that these social protection programs can really help developing countries navigate these challenges of globalization and build more resilient economies. And just to conclude, I like to just allude to the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, who says that no state, however powerful, can protect itself on its own. So it's really important that this multilateralism that we work under to feed a correctly globalized world is in gear. So thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. That's excellent sweep. It is one of the things about the globalized world that we thought that it will be a both movement of capital and labor, and then now we are stuck with countries putting up barriers and continents putting up barriers for movement of labor, most importantly. So the need to create jobs is foremost. Almira, I turn to you. Fresh off Brazil's G20 presidency, very successful, congratulations. And you put on the table the issue of equality, which South Africa's G20 presidency is going to take forward. Tell us how you have advanced this agenda of rebalancing the globalization agenda.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the questions, Anit. I would begin with two comments before answering directly to your question. When we think about the G20 grouping, for instance, these 4 presidencies in a row of developing countries from Asia, South America, and Africa, they have contributed to present a view of developing countries in terms of the globalization process. But not only this, especially what went wrong and what the imbalances are. And why that's important? Because we have the legitimacy to say this because we are countries that face these kinds of hardships. We have challenges to meet. So, in a certain way, we can say that there is even if Global South is not and has not an identity, an essence easily recognizable, it has a kind of like-minded approach of different countries, and mentioning, for instance, Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. So, despite our idiosyncrasies, and we coincide in many international issues, and the social agenda is one of them. As a sort of informal leadership, we can exert, these countries, a positive influence on various multilateral fora, starting with G20, but not only. What's important to remark here is the dynamics unleashed by the discussions in groupings like the G20 are fundamental due to the political force in terms of forming an agenda and influencing other governments around the world. And that's why, for instance, T20 think tanks, for instance, they are very, very important. So when you think about rebalancing globalization, if we start thinking about our own countries, what we see is that we face many socio-economical challenges in creating jobs, as Pamela said, in terms of health, in terms of education, and things like this. But I would underscore the social inclusion as the principle that should guide governmental actions through public policies designed to improve socio-economic conditions. The Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, launched by the Brazilian government, is an example of what has to be done. The G20 Brazil focused on fight against hunger and poverty in particular, but if you consider in a broader sense, it was talking about inequality. And why inequality? Because inequality is something that is growing, it's raising, even within developed countries. You have inequality raising in developed and in development countries. But there's another point I would like to mention here, beside of the broad agenda that's covered by the book, is that it's also important that we have the public policies capable of understanding the problems and proposing actionable measures. It's also important, so in this, what I'm trying to say here, I'm trying to say that's important not only to know what to do, but how to do it. And in public management, for instance, implementation is part of a management cycle that encompasses plan, act or implement, check and adjust. In general, we talk a lot about plan and not not much about the other aspects of this cycle. So for me, it comes as no surprise, for instance, and there's another point of rebalancing globalizations, that SDGs are lagging when one thinks that the management conditions are, in many cases, not in place. Take, for example, the Summit of the Future document. It dedicates only half a page for implementation. It envisages turbocharging full implementation, but it doesn't tell in detail how to do it. And when you think about the Global South, how different our countries are, we need to have some clues, a better view of how to do things. They are not automatic. They are not going to do by themselves, okay? They are not auto-implementable. Saying this, I'm not underestimating the fact that for achieving fixed goals, finance is a key element in making public policies efficient and effective. We talk a lot about finance, but I'm saying that it's necessary to focus on building adequate capacity and capability, both in terms of institution and bureaucracy. So, the financial issue is key to vulnerable countries that face hardships in obtaining the necessary funds for their development needs. Notwithstanding, we cannot forget that transparency and accountability are more and more demanded from lenders, and I'm talking here about governments or about MDBs, to those that will use the funds allotted. For no other reasons in Brazil, I come back with another Brazilian example, we saw the creation of the G20, the supreme audit institutions, because the use of money is something that should be also part of the rebalanced globalization. Without the proper conditions, you don't get the results you're hoping to. And in conclusion, I would say that the three issues that should be at the center of the Global South countries' attention in terms of the rebalancing globalization is the social agenda, the fight against inequality as a whole, and as a part of a strategy to fight hunger and poverty, the promotion of sustainable development and a just energy transition, and biofuels is something that we could talk more. Brazil has a very strong experience in that. And last but not least, the reform of global governance institutions, financial, WTO, and the UN Charter. Thank you.
Thank you, Almi. That's a very long and agenda, but very necessary. So we'll probably come back in the second round, and maybe there will be questions from the audience about it. Riyatu, I turn to you. Indonesia is the first, the leader in the four. We are following in the train. You were the engine. And so how did the G20 Indonesia play out when it started to this idea of the Global South leading the G20 and putting forward the issues from your G20 presidency? Also, let me just, since you are there, I have you here. Indonesia is now considered a connector economy. You are in a region which is very strategic in terms of geopolitics, geoeconomics. You're a huge commodity producer. You're also, in terms of supply chains, you're one of those destinations. So how does Indonesia see itself, like taking forward from the G20, but in the future, how do you see yourself in this rebalanced, globalized world in a region which is pretty dynamic, to put it mildly?
Oh, big question. Okay, thank you, Anit. But I think in the context of Indonesia, the concept of G20, we have the Troika. So before Indonesia is Italy, and after Indonesia is India at the time. And I think we are very supported as well with India. from the perspective of government, from the perspective of Indonesia, is actually in the context of how we are having role in the global and multilateralism. It needs also links to the domestic agenda as well. It needs to also link that the concept, the agenda, the development agenda, given that what is the benefit for the population itself. So the context of SDGs, the context of even climate finance and development needs to also links to development growth and also addressing inequality. So at the time, it is also we just facing all globally. How is the need of the cooperation, yet it's not quite satisfactory in terms of the response of pandemic COVID-19 at the time, where like some countries might have access to vaccine first, then developing countries might lag behind. Even in the case of, even when we have resources, it still need to competition. So in terms of the institution of multilateralism itself, it needs to function as public goods, common public goods, but yet it seemed like a referee at the time. So it's not quite, as expected. But the case is we are seeing many initiative country platform that have at the time. So it is also relieving that we can also learn from other developing countries, from the regions, and also developed countries as well. So I think that the G20, we see that it might, in terms of the membership itself, the large member is from developing countries, and in terms of the size is also improving. So given that the sequence of the presidency, the all for developing countries, and in the context of Indonesia, we are like resource-based economy, maybe to also similar some of the African countries, and also the context of Brazil itself in terms of climate finance, conservation is also in addition to energy transition. So we have some of like priority that we are also new from India, that you are also the connector like ORF here with Tamubeki. So I think it's also we are optimists of that development agenda, even that this we have the global uncertainty, the geopolitical tensions, and somehow I think G20 forum and inclusiveness in the engagement group as well, the context of, for example, in the presidency of Indonesia is like we established Supreme Audit Agency as the additional of engagement group. This is also the context of cooperations, most of cooperation of the MDBs with the government, but it needs the government to function, to accountable, and to deliver. So I think somehow the inclusiveness of engagement group can also brings value to practicality of the G20 as well. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting insight. I mean, making it more inclusive after coming out of COVID, when we had all these virtual meetings, and then everybody was happy to be in Indonesia, right? And also you created this space for more engagement groups, for different kinds of engagements, and that I think India took forward, and then Brazil, and I'm sure that will be the case with South Africa. Mr. Sato, I turn to you last but not the least, because you are the person in charge of finance. So you're going to make all this happen. The specific question that I wanted you to address is, essentially you're based in England. You look after a region which is Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I think there cannot be more of a direct north-south connection through the middle.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for having me today. And first of all, how can I say that I fully agree that Pamela that no countries can survive on its own in this world. So that's why that Japan and also that developing countries that we are strong believer that how can I say that to seek for that mutual benefit for strengthen and deepening the developing countries. And that regarding the finance issues, that how can I say that as this everybody knows about the financial gap and the finance needs is an enormous amount. And as you see that the last COP 29, even though that developed country that are committed that the 300 billion per year by 2035, but still there is a dissatisfaction that, about this kind of commitment from the viewpoint of the developing country. So how to fill in the gap that this kind of the huge financial gap? But do you think that the developed countries are reluctant to support and contribute to the developing countries? I don't think so actually. But even that the developed countries also have their own constraint actually. And right now that many developed countries have the domestic issues right now. And if you were the leader of the developed country, that if you provide the financial aid for the foreign countries while ignoring the domestic issues, maybe that such kind of leader will disappear in the next election. And this is not a sustainable situation. So how to make the sustainable situation is really important. So in terms of the financial lenders, that make the project is feasible is really important. Maybe that in terms of the developing countries that you would like to have and you would like to maximize the grant aid for each addressing the problem, but grant aid is at a very limited number. So that's why that maybe that you can easily imagine that where is the funds in the world. The fund is in the private sector. So how to mobilize the private sector's funds is really important. And JBIC is, for example, for me, that I spent 30 years in these banks, how to be the catalyst was mobilizing the private fund. So we have a lot of that experience, and also in India, in Brazil, in Indonesia, in South Africa, there are a lot of the good experience already. So that's why what I would like to emphasize is that to share the same, the successful experience with the developing countries, and as Amir said, that harmonizing the process over transparent accountability is really important, because I think that there are a lot of the potential investors in the private sectors who would like to invest in the developing countries, but from the viewpoint of the lenders, that there are a lot of the risks of such kind of projects, and such kind of the project risk that can be taken by investors, host countries, and lenders that default. So that's why the principle of this kind of risk taking is that the party which can take the risk is the most appropriate way. And right now that what is my experience in these areas, as you see that, for example, according to the IEA report, I understand that more than 80% of the so-called the green investment has been made in the developed country or China. So it's very less amount for dedicated to the developing countries. But to me, that from my experience, for example, that there are a lot of the green investment in Middle East. So why that the Middle East can mobilize such kind of the private funds? That is that there is a very, how can I say, the resilient legal framework and the comfortable circumstance for the private investors. So how to share such kind of the framework with the developing country is really important right now. And of course, that I don't ignore the how to incorporate the Global South's opinion in the multilateral institution like World Bank. But what I should keep in mind is that if that keeping that arguing it's a long time that, for example, that we should discuss, we should continue to discuss that in 5 years, in 10 years from now on. That is that I would like to avoid. So how to share the good experience is the key, and we can do now to mobilize the funds. And finally, that I also would like to touch upon the supply chain resilient issues, because that as a result of the COVID-19 or to avoid the over-independence in the one single countries, that's kind of the supply chain resilient issue is a much focused area from the viewpoint of especially the developed countries. So this is a very good chance for the developing country for this kind of the movement. So how to take this chance with you, that is really important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sato. I'm mindful that we are sitting between lunch and you, so we also have 10 minutes. I would like to open the floor, and then we can come back for a discussion. Yes, Prime Minister, and if you can just please line up in front of the mics and...
Thank you, Anna. Two very brief points and then a question for the panel. First point, globalisation has been good for the world. Globalisation has actually meant equalisation. If you look at the gap, the wealth gap between the relatively rich and the relatively poor, it's much less today than it was 40 years ago. The second point, globalisation really happened because of a big reduction in geopolitical tensions after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And those tensions have now returned, in part because China has taken advantage of globalisation through technological theft, the subsidisation of national champions to dominate particular industries and so on. So my question to the panel is China, at least under the CCP, an obstacle to a return to a beneficial form of globalisation?
Great, very provocative. Thank you, Prime Minister, but important. Can I come to this side, ma'am, if you could introduce yourself?
Thank you very much. My name is Moira Feil. I work for the German government on G20, in particular for the Development Ministry, and I would like to ask, seeing that we have such accumulative knowledge of think tanks at the panel today, two questions. The first is, we've come full cycle now. We know that the Global South has had the presidency the last 4 years, which has been very exciting for people like us working on development in the Global North. This might come to a bit of a rude awakening with the beginning of the second 20 cycle next year, the year after next, with the US presidency. Let's see what happens. But I would like to ask whether you would advise a different sequence for the coming cycle. That's my first question. And the second question builds a little bit on the geopolitical tensions that former Prime Minister Abbott just mentioned. The atmosphere around the table for finding consensus is increasingly hard, and we now saw in Brazil that even one country sort of rejects frameworks such as Agenda 2030 and SDGs. So with that in mind, do you have any specific advice regarding the South African presidency? Because those of us who still want to achieve the SDGs and bring this forward don't want to be hijacked by rogue interaction. Thank you.
Excellent. And we'll take the last one, and then we'll get to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. So hopefully my question is not as audacious.
Can you please introduce yourself?
Sorry, my name is Chayu. I'm from Macroeconomic Consultancy in Sri Lanka. My question is on thematically similar grounds. I think in the discussion, and across these 2 days, we've come to the agreement that there is at least an aspirational consensus on what the Global South is about. But we also did discuss about, and to me it seems that there are macroeconomic divergences in terms of the incentives. For example, China's more of a production export economy, so from the ground up, incentives tend to be structured towards that. India, on the other hand, is more of an import consumption economy. Ground up, incentives end up being structured towards that. So in that kind of context, what I'm really kind of asking and trying to get a perspective on is how do we think of the Global South in a context where you have that kind of aspirational consensus, but divergences, tensions that can come about from different macroeconomic incentives from the individual firm sector and then across to domestic policy consensus. And does that mean we have to, do we lean into those contradictions, to those tensions, to the manyness of the Global South? Do we try towards finding greater consensus, a single voice? What is the kind of way you would frame those kind of diverging incentives from the aspirational and from the, let's say, economic policy kind of direction?
Excellent questions, hard ones. So anybody wants to put up the hand on the China question? If not, I'll just assign it to Almir.
No, I think there are very different questions. In the first one, regarding to globalization, well, for sure, it's a good thing. Globalization has its advantages and its qualities, let's say, like this. But we see that the problems are also there, and one of them is inequality. We are in a world that is becoming more and more unequal, where it's harder and harder to find consensus. It's harder to engage dialogues. So it's a very challenging situation, okay? And that's why I believe that the Global South can play an important, a relevant role in this case. Because even if, and I'm using the question of the gentleman there, if there are differences in terms of economic approach, macroeconomics and things like this, it's easier, I believe, to reach a consensus, to reach a compromise when you're talking about countries like Indonesia, Brazil, India, and South Africa than otherwise, okay? And also talking about the other questions, the suggestions, in my view, as Global South still doesn't have an identity and an essence, it's very important for these countries to continue and even make stronger the dialogue between themselves, not because they will come up with all the solutions, but they will contribute to the dialogue and finding the right solutions. That's very important. And in a very practical way, in terms of a suggestion to the G20 South Africa presidency, I would say, like we did in Brazil, like we did with T20, we also paid a lot of attention not only on formulating ideas, but also in how to implement them. It seems sometimes we think that it's automatic, it's come very easily, and it's not so. We are living in a very different world with very different countries. The manner of doing things will vary enormously, and so that's why we need also to pay attention on how to do things. Thank you.
Diplomatically put, thank you. I think, yes, please. Yes, please go ahead.
Regarding the China issues, that I would like to share that my views. That because now I'm stationed in London, but from before that I spent at Washington D.C. for years about this situation, and actually that the U.S. is very hawkish about China right now in terms of the national security issues, and maybe that the U.S. is a much more independent country, so maybe they can do that. But when I was in London, this is a very different atmosphere against China, and also that the UK's position is different from the EU country too. For example, as you see that in terms of the Chinese EV sectors, that the EU put that additional tax on the Chinese EV, but the UK didn't say so. So such kind of each different situation. And Japan also as you see that Japan is the neighbors of the China. Even Russia is also neighbor. So that is how to manage the relationship is really important. And China is still a very important partner, not only Japan, but also the developing countries. Many developing countries, the number one trade counterpart is China. So how to incorporate into the China? But what is our experience is if that we over dependence on China is a risk. So just we are very worried about the developing country is heavily relied on China. Thank you.
Yes, Pamela, very quick. if you want to address any of these, but
Sure.
please.
Just very quickly on the rebalancing globalization. From an African perspective, I think we know that there are imbalances in terms of income, productivity, and economic complexities. Although some progress has been made in terms of social dynamics, there are still a lot of setbacks in terms of the cultural dynamics, the language dynamics, as well as the life expectancy and education. But Africa is a rising population. We know that there can be shortfalls and opportunities in that, and I think it's very important to leverage on a more productive population and leverage on the demographic dividend on that. On the question quickly on the US taking the G20 and whether the format will change much, I think that it will, in terms of, I think whether we say it or not, there might be a clear change in format, but I think South Africa has a wonderful opportunity through its diversity, its strengths in terms of what we have, its geographical location and its positioning, its diplomatic relations with the US. I think it's important for them, for South Africa to convene, especially in the African context, where they can make sure that African economies contribute to the global value chains as well. And I think they stand in a very good position to make sure that they just don't hand over, but accompany the US through the processes that was decided by the Global South. Thank you.
Well put. Riatu, just last.
Okay, maybe add on the context of think tank engagement. So I think it is also in the case of Indonesia, we have not quite large think tank in terms of that, especially in the context of specialized issue in international relations or other national security and mostly of development. So this is also starting, I think, before, I think I also heard in Brazil and before the think tank also developed this Global South think tank, and we also learn from each other here, and in the context of Indonesia, I think to some extent it is also we are involving not as large as India or as Brazil, but we are involving not only the think tank but also the university, and also it is also done in a large scale in India, and I think it will stay, and maybe given that the focus on development agenda is still going to be beneficial also for each country to learn through engagement group, and I think even in Indonesia, in terms of after the G20's chairmanship of ASEAN, we actually mimic the inclusiveness of this G20, some part of it in the Asian chairmanship. Thank you.